What's going on, y'all? Back again. Quick little Trav film tip. We're diving into frame rates. There's a couple different frame rates out there. You probably see them when you're filming, you're doing your Zoom calls, etc. Regular film frame rates or video frame rates, there's, I would say, three main ones these days. There used to be one, then two, and now there's a bunch. But the three that you want to know the most is, so you got 24 frames per second. 24 frames per second. Sometimes it's 23.98 frames per second, but that's basically your standard Hollywood film look. Now a lot are shot in higher frame rates, but this was, in the 90s and the 80s, 70s. It was usually mimicked what we kind of saw as people. Like, you look and there's some motion blur and you move your hand. And this frame rate, which is the amount of photographs per second, that's what an FPS is, frames per second. That is the frame rate. 24 FPS would be 24 frames per second, which means there's 24 of this picture from now, 1 Mississippi, 2. So there's 24 of those pictures. So that's 24 frames per second, standard Hollywood 70s, 80s, 90s movie frame rate. The next frame rate is 30 frames per second. So 30 frames per second. So 30. So it's about 6 more frames per second than the 24. Sony Focus did it perfectly, like I knew you would. The 30 frames per second is a lot of television is shot like that. Nowadays it's kind of these, I would say 30 frames per second, which is sometimes 29.97, and you just round it up. Same thing, now there's 30 pictures for every 1 second. And I would say now it's even kind of taken over as the go-to, like events are shot, early shown as that, broadcast TV is shown as that. It's kind of the television standard, I would say, and also just a standard format for talking vids like this. Even though I usually shoot this and these at 24 frames per second. Double checking, yep. That's just because that's what I was taught, and I like the kind of more cinematic, filmic look they'll even characterize as 24, just due to the nature of that's what movies were shot in for the most part and still are. And that's why, just quick side rant, the Lord of the Rings Hobbit was shot in 48 frames per second, which is basically double 24. So it's similar to when you shoot, we'll talk about this later too, 60 frames per second, and you put on the 30 frames per second timeline, you can slow it down a little bit, and that's why a lot of people just shoot in higher frame rates now, because they can slow it down in post-processing, but we'll go to that a little later. But that's why The Hobbit looked kind of weird, because it was a non-native frame rate that we're used to. We're so used to seeing 24 or even 30. 48 kind of has this hyper-realistic look to it, similar to 60. But we're kind of used to 60. It's used in a lot of the newer Marvel, I think, even. But, so 30 frames per second, that's the classic. It's the new go-to. It's a new go-to. And the third most used one, I would say now, is 60 frames per second. 60. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I think the new Avengers were shot in 60 frames per second. And then maybe even Transformers. I might just be talking out of my ass here. But that just creates we got a lovely dog showing up on the shoot. Thank you for ruining my shoot. Perfect. Yeah, I'm completely off track now, but no, we're back. So after the dog got me good, 60 frames per second is basically double 30. So it's 30 frames per second times 2, 60. So it's 1 Mississippi. So 60 photos in between there. So the main thing is it'll just look super smooth and there won't be any motion blur. So it kind of ends up having this very hyper-realistic look, and everything's moving like a giant action movie and nothing's in motion blur. But the beauty of that is, so any of those frame rates, the higher one, 60, and then we'll even have 120, which is double 60. And the thing about 120 and 60 is a lot of times you can just shoot in those, and then you play them back at a percentage that corresponds equally on a timeline you're editing. So say you shoot a couple things in 60 and 120, and your actual movie is in 30 frames per second at an event. So you have 30 frames per second, that's all your talking heads and normal stuff. And then you shoot a few things in 60 frames or 120 frames per second. You put them on your 30 timeline, your 30 frames per second timeline, and you slow them down the percentage that it would be of 30 and 60. So that'd be 50%. And for 120, that would be, I need to double check because I'm just doing so many 24 frame per second timeline. I think that would be, let me see if I can figure this out. 1/2 of 60, I think it'd be 25%. Yeah, possibly 25%. So you would do 25% of 100 on the 120. So it's going 25% as fast as it normally would. So it'll look smooth because there's more pictures. 120 is more pictures, so on the 30 frames per second timeline, it'll look nice and smooth, be like a cool skate photo where the guy does all the tricks and lands. But there'll be even more, and it'll just move as a slow motion. So that's how slow motion shot. So, all right, y'all. Just wanted to kind of quickly breeze through those, and you can kind of pick your favorite, shoot higher to go slow-mo. And that's why on Zoom calls or any streaming service, a lot of times you'll sometimes see the frame rate go to 5 or 10 or 15. And you'll see how it's kind of going, because there's only a couple pictures in each second, so it ends up being a super slow frame rate. So that's a little interesting tidbit, but alright, thanks for tuning in to another episode. This is a little trap film tip. Till next time, peace.